here we go. We are going to read chapters 4 and 5 today of Owen Foote, Super Spy. Chapter 4 is called Fancy Meeting You Here. Come in, Owen. Come in, Owen. Owen held the walkie-talkie up to his mouth and pressed the button. Owen here. Green car alert. Green car alert. Anthony's voice was full of static. Over and out, said Owen. He clicked off the walkie-talkie and shouted, "Duck or die!" and hurled himself into the ditch by the side of the road. Joseph dove between a pile of rocks. They were there just in time. A green car came flying around the corner and sped past them in the blast of warm air. Whew, that was a close one. Joseph crawled out from behind his hiding post. That guy was going fast. The car had disappeared around the corner. You know whose road is down there, don't you? Owen said. The smile slid from Joseph's face. I'd better call them in. Owen pushed the speak button. Owen to Anthony. Owen to Anthony. There was a squawk, then a voice. What's up? It was Ben. Enemy territory straight ahead, said Owen. We'll wait for you. Over and out. He put the walkie-talkie in his back pocket and looked at Joseph. The game was over. Owen had invented it the night before while he was laying in bed, thinking about Ben's walkie-talkies. He named it Duck or Die. The way it worked was that he and Joseph were one team, Anthony and Ben were another, and the cars were the enemy. He and Joseph had started down the road first. Anthony and Ben gave them a 5-minute lead. Then they started walking too. If a car came from their direction, Anthony and Ben had to radio a warning to Owen and Joseph. If it came from their direction, Owen and Joseph had to warn them. If a car got to your team before you hid, you were dead. It was a lot of fun. They had been playing it for more than an hour now. They had worked their way down Chesterfield Road, jumping over bushes and rolling on the ground. But now Mr. Mahoney's road was around the corner. The real game was about to begin. Anthony and Ben ran up to them. They were out of breath. Mr. Mahoney's road is right down there, said Owen. They looked to where he was pointing and nodded solemnly. We can cut through the woods here and get there in about 5 minutes. No more talking and no more walkie-talkies. No fair, said Anthony. They're the best part. Owen's right, Ben said. He put his in his pocket. They make too much noise. You know, Mr. Mahoney, Joseph said nervously, he hears everything, even things kids haven't said yet. They all looked at one another. It was true. Some kids at school had said Mr. Mahoney had a radio receiver implanted in his ear. Other kids swore he could read minds. No one felt safe after having bad thoughts when Mr. Mahoney was around, much less doing bad things. And here they were, getting ready to spy on him in his own backyard. Joseph coughed. Owen knew what that meant. If they didn't go right now, Joseph might either change his mind or throw up. If he threw up, they'd all change their minds. Owen put his camouflage down over his head. Come on, he said gruffly. He jumped over the ditch and started into the woods. Joseph and Anthony and Ben scrambled up the small hill behind him. No one wanted to be left behind. Owen walked as quietly as he could. The other boys followed behind him single file. Owen held on to branches that stuck out in front of him so they wouldn't whip back and hit anyone in the face. For a few minutes, they walked in silence. There was no one else around. Then Owen spotted something through the trees. He stopped and motioned toward it. When everyone had seen it, he started moving again cautiously. It was a house. A brown house. Owen let the air seep slowly out of him with relief. The Mahoney's house was red. He wasn't ready to reach the Mahoney's house. Not just yet. They filed past the brown house silently. There was a trampoline on one side of the yard and a wooden swing set in the middle. Owen saw a fenced-in area with a small doghouse inside. His heart stopped beating. What if the Mahoneys had a dog? He hadn't thought of that. It would be a military dog if they did, knowing Mr. Mahoney, trained to sniff out spies at 100 yards, to run them to the ground and stand over them snarling until the Marines arrived. Owen racked his mind, trying to remember. A cool sweat broke out on his forehead. If he had asked the other guys, they might get cold feet. Joseph would know why he was asking for sure. So he kept walking. After a few minutes, they passed a yellow house. That yard was deserted too. It started to feel as if all they were doing was taking an innocent walk around the woods. When he heard sounds of scuffling behind him, Owen turned around. Anthony was holding Ben's walkie-talkie up above his head, and Ben was trying to shove him off balance. "Quiet," Owen said in a low voice. "We're getting close." Ben snatched the walkie-talkie out of Anthony's hand. They fell into line again. Then Owen saw it through the trees. The side of a dark red house. He pointed to it silently. The mood was suddenly tense. Looking at the Mahoney's house, he wondered if maybe they should go back to playing duck or die instead. Mess around with the walkie-talkie some more. Anthony would like that, he knew. Then Joseph whispered in his ear, "Maybe this isn't such a good idea." That did it. No way was he going to chicken out now. Owen kept walking, leading them along the ridge that ran right along the rear of the Mahoney's backyard. It wasn't high, but it was steep. A straight drop of dirt and rocks down to grass. The edge looked crumbly, so Owen kept away from it. He was heading toward a clump of bushes halfway along the ridge. It would make the perfect spying place. Down below, the Mahoney's yard was empty. There was a deck with a round table and chairs. A book was lying open on the table next to a blue striped chaise lounge. Owen saw a barbecue grill next to the deck and a garden in the middle of the yard. There was a shovel sticking out of it, as if whoever had been working had suddenly been called away. Maybe the Mahoneys weren't even home, Owen thought suddenly. Maybe they had gone grocery shopping. The possibility made him giddy with relief. Then a door slammed and he froze. Mrs. Mahoney came out onto the deck carrying a tall glass. She put the glass on the table next to the book. She sat down on the end of the chaise and untied her sneakers. She dropped them on the deck, swung her legs onto the cushion, and picked up the book. She started to read. Owen was afraid to breathe. If they moved, Mrs. Mahoney might look up and see them. If they stayed here, frozen in plain sight, she'd definitely see them. He headed for the bushes as fast as he could without running. When he slid in behind them, Joseph, Anthony, and Ben were fast on his heels. The clump wasn't nearly as big as it had looked. They had to scrunch up into little balls and wrap their arms around their knees so no one's arm or leg would stick out. They were jockeying noiselessly for position when the door slammed again. Owen looked down. It was Mr. Mahoney. He handed his wife a bowl and said something that made her laugh. Then he walked down the steps and over to the garden. He grabbed the shovel and started to dig. Owen turned his head and saw Anthony and Joseph and Ben staring at him like deer caught in the headlights of a car. They were actually doing it. They were spying on Mr. Mahoney. Up till now, spying on Mr. Mahoney had been an idea. Owen had never really gotten so far as to imagine how it would really feel to finally see Mr. Mahoney. Now he knew. It would feel terrifying. Here was Mr. Mahoney, the principal of Chesterfield School, relaxing in his own backyard. And here was Owen, crammed behind a bush with 3 other kids spying on him. If they moved, Mr. Mahoney would hear them. If they ran, Mr. Mahoney would see them. The bush seemed to be growing smaller by the second. Mr. Mahoney was working his way slowly down a garden row, turning over the soil one methodical shovel at a time. Every once in a while, he or Mr. Mahoney said something, but mostly they were quiet. For a few minutes, no one behind the bush moved. They kept their eyes trained on Mr. Mahoney. Then gradually the shock began to wear off. Owen could think, and what he thought was that Mr. Mahoney looked amazingly normal. He was hypnotized by his garden the same way Owen's dad was. He was wearing a hat with a brim that went all the way around it, like the one Owen's dad wore. And it looked just as corny. Even the dark stains spreading over the middle of his back looked like plain old sweat. Mr. Mahoney looked like a happy man enjoying his privacy in his own backyard. Watching him, Owen came to a terrible realization. He would hate it if Mr. Mahoney did anything embarrassing. He didn't want to be able to laugh about him afterwards with Joseph and Anthony and Ben. He didn't want Mr. Mahoney to do anything that would make him look silly. He wanted Mr. Mahoney to be Mr. Mahoney, awesome principal of Chesterfield School. He felt someone squirming beside him. Ben made a face and pointed to his legs. Owen knew what he meant. His legs were starting to ache too, and his camouflage was itching like crazy. He took it off and looked over at the other guys. Joseph still looked worried, but Anthony made a face. This is boring face. Owen looked at his watch. They had only been here for 15 minutes. It felt more like 15 hours. Mr. Mahoney got to the end of the row and started another. Owen counted. There were 10 rows in all. 9 more left. 9 times 15. Owen didn't even have to do the math. This was going to go on for a long time. Someone tapped him on the shoulder. It was Anthony. He jerked his thumb back over his shoulder. Owen shook his head. There was no way they could move without Mr. Mahoney hearing them. Next to him, Joseph was trying to get comfortable. He rocked back and forth on his bottom. Owen had to put a hand on the ground to keep from being knocked over. There was nothing they could do but wait. Joseph nudged him with his elbow and blinked. "What?" Owen mouthed. Joseph blinked again. Owen shook his head to say he didn't understand. "The bathroom," Joseph whispered. Anthony clamped his hand over his mouth and started to move his shoulders up and down as if he was laughing. Owen glared at him to make him stop, but it was no use. Anthony wasn't afraid anymore. He was bored. So was Ben. He leaned against Joseph and made a soft hissing sound. Psst. Anthony started to laugh for real. Ben did too. They were jiggling around, banging against one another like twin volcanoes about to erupt. There wasn't enough room in that small space to contain them. Before Owen knew what was happening, they bumped into Joseph. Joseph bumped into him, and he was sent sprawling out from behind the bush. And then he was falling, tumbling head over heels down the hill with dirt flying up around his face and rocks jabbing into his back. His camouflage was ripped out of his hands. He grabbed a branch and felt prickers dig into his skin. It was over as quickly as it had begun. Owen landed on his back at the bottom of the hill so hard it knocked the wind out of him. He lay there in a daze and heard the sound of the other boys crashing away through the woods above him. Then he heard an even worse sound. Do you know what it is? Footsteps. Mr. Mahoney's face blotted out the blue sky above Owen's head like a storm cloud. "Owen Foote," he said pleasantly. "Fancy meeting you here." Chapter 5. Punish us now, please. Who is it? Is he all right? Mrs. Mahoney came running across the yard. "It's Owen Foote, and he's fine," said Mr. Mahoney. He helped Owen to his feet. "He's a little scratched up, that's all." Mrs. Mahoney's worried face peered into Owen's. "We always warned our sons to be careful on that ridge," she said. "No matter how many bushes we plant, it keeps eroding. What were you doing up there?" Mr. Mahoney didn't have to ask. When he came back down the hill, he had Owen's camouflage in his hand. "Nice job," he said, holding it out. "You made it yourself?" All Owen could do was nod. Mrs. Mahoney was making worried noises, checking him over for damage. "Oh dear," she said. She took Owen's left hand in her own. "Your hand is bleeding." "It doesn't hurt," Owen lied. He pulled it away and rubbed it against his pants. Mr. Mahoney patted his wife on her shoulder. "He's fine, Patsy. I can take it from here." He sounded the way he did in school when there was a problem. It meant he was in charge, and everyone should leave. It always worked. People melted away fast. No one wanted to be around when the trouble started. "All right, dear." Mrs. Mahoney gave Owen a quick smile. "If you want a Band-Aid for that, you let me know." And she left. Mr. Mahoney looked up to the top of the ridge. "It appears your troops have deserted you," he said. Owen looked up too. Mr. Mahoney must have heard them running away. Now he was waiting for Owen to give him an explanation. Owen looked down at the ground. He couldn't think of a thing to say. He was as empty as the ridge. Then he heard a cough. Owen looked up and saw Joseph walking carefully toward the edge of the ridge. His face was bright red. The camouflage flap of his hat was dangling over one shoulder by a thread. To Owen, he had never looked more wonderful. "I thought you might not be far away, Joseph," said Mr. Mahoney. "Be careful coming down." Joseph partly slid, partly stumbled his way down the hill. When he got to the bottom, Mr. Mahoney grabbed him by the arm to keep him from falling. Joseph darted a nervous glance at Owen. "So," said Mr. Mahoney. He stood there smiling at them, waiting. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. A whole silent conversation was going on among the three of them. Owen and Joseph knew that Mr. Mahoney knew that they had been spying, and Mr. Mahoney knew they knew he knew. There he is, coming down the hill. Now he was waiting to see what they would say. Owen's brain was careening around like a car on an obstacle course. He couldn't tell the truth. It was too embarrassing. But he couldn't lie either. Mr. Mahoney was an expert in kids lying. He told them the same thing every year at the school spirit assembly. Owen had heard it 3 times now. "You should always tell the truth because you know it's the right thing to do," he'd say. "But in case you ever get confused about what's the truth and what's not, I have my own lie detector right up here." Then he would tap his forehead slowly 3 times while he looked around the crowded bleachers. "It can spot a lie a mile away." Every kid in the gym felt like Mr. Mahoney's eyes were boring right into their brain stuffed with possible lies and mean thoughts. They'd all stare back at him in awe, the way Owen and Joseph were doing right now. It was Joseph who finally spoke. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Do?" Mr. Mahoney rubbed his stubbly chin. "That's a good question, Joseph. I guess what I will do will depend on what you tell me you were doing." Oh, it was going from bad to worse. "I'll tell you what," said Mr. Mahoney suddenly. "Let's not talk about this right now. Let's all think about it for a week. You two come back next Saturday, and we'll talk about it again. Okay?" "No, not okay," Owen wanted to say. "Punish us now and get it over with. Please." But Mr. Mahoney was already leading them across the yard toward the road. He was saying something friendly about his garden, as if Owen and Joseph had stopped by to buy tomatoes or something. Owen and Joseph stumbled along beside him like sleepwalkers in the middle of a nightmare. Mr. Mahoney stopped when they got to the corner of the garage. "You might want to put something on that hand when you get home," he said to Owen. "I've got to get back to work, boys. I'll see you in school." "Okay." Owen raised his hand in the air, then let it drop back to his side. "Bye." "Yeah," said Joseph. "Bye." They had almost made it to the road when Mr. Mahoney called out to them. "Oh, and Owen?" he said in a loud voice. Owen and Joseph both turned around. "If any of the other troops want to come with you, they're welcome." "Oh, thanks," said Owen. He started to walk again. All he wanted to do was get away, to get off this road and away from this house as fast as possible. He didn't say a word to Joseph. He didn't even look at him. He wouldn't blame Joseph if he hated him for the rest of his life. Then Joseph said, "Sorry I ran away, Owen." Owen looked at him. "You're sorry?" he said. "What do you mean? I got us into this mess." Joseph shrugged. "Yeah, but before it was a mess, it was exciting." "I thought I was going to throw up when I saw Mr. Mahoney's face," Owen said. "Oh, I did too," said Joseph, "when I knocked you down the hill." "You didn't knock me. Ben and Anthony did." They couldn't help it. There was no room. They started to walk again. Joseph was right. Owen couldn't blame anyone. They had made a plan, and it had failed. What mattered now was next Saturday. "Where did Anthony and Ben go?" he said. "Oh, I don't know." Joseph shrugged. "Home, probably." More silence. You know, that's the first time I've ever been to Mr. Mahoney's office, Joseph said finally. Well, not his office. You know what I mean. It's not as scary when you're at school. He expects you to be bad there. Yeah, I don't think he was expecting you to roll down the hill like that. Probably not, said Owen. What did he look like? A little surprised. I bet, Owen kicked half-heartedly at a stone in the road. I wish it was Sunday, he said finally. I mean, next Sunday. Me too, Joseph said. And then they didn't say any more, because there was nothing more to say. Ben and Anthony were waiting for them at the corner of Chesterfield Road. What did he do? What did he say? Anthony was hopping up and down, waiting to hear the worst. Was he mad? Oh, I bet he was furious. Owen looked at Ben. Ben's hands were hanging down at his sides. His face had a look on it Owen couldn't read. What's your punishment? Anthony said eagerly. What's he going to do? Give you 1,000 weeks of detention? He said it like it was funny, like the whole thing had been a spy movie and not real life, and that Owen and Joseph were just actors who had gotten caught, not friends Anthony had deserted. Where'd you guys go? Owen said. He was suddenly very angry. Why'd you run away like that? You should have come back like Joseph. Are you crazy? Said Anthony. No way was I going to hang around and get in trouble. We were out of there, right, Ben? I ran. Ben's voice was flat. I didn't even think about it. I just ran. Owen was suddenly sick of the whole thing. Yeah, well, thanks a lot, you guys, he said disgustedly. Let's go, Joseph. He and Joseph started to walk again. Come on, Owen, tell us what he said Anthony. He said we have to go back there next Saturday, Owen said over his shoulder. He said the rest of our troops should come with us. That wasn't entirely true, he knew. Mr. Mahoney had said they could come back, not should. Owen didn't think Mr. Mahoney even knew who the other kids were. But why should he tell them that? Let them stew. Anthony ran to catch up to them. You didn't tell him who was with you, did you? He looked from Owen to Joseph and back to Owen again. Did you? That's for us to know and you to find out. Right, Joseph? Right, Joseph said. No fair. Come on, you guys, Anthony wheedled. You didn't, did you? He stopped, but Owen and Joseph kept walking. Did you? He yelled. Maybe, maybe not, shouted Owen. He threw his arm over Joseph's shoulder. We'll let him sweat it out, he said. Yeah, said Joseph, like we're going to. It wasn't a huge consolidation, but it was better than nothing. And that's the end of chapters 4 and 5. Join me tomorrow for the last 2 chapters of the book. See you soon.